All right, class. Welcome to Mr. Somerville's online geometry learning environment here. Um, as this is our first online lesson, I'd like to take a minute just to talk to you about what it might look like on a typical lesson where we're working from our textbook, which is what we'll be doing today. So the process will usually involve a screen recording like I'm doing now that briefly introduces the lesson, talks about some of the main learning objectives and connects it to things that we've done previously. And then after that introduction, you'll be pausing the video to work through the lesson at your own pace. Once you've taken your time and completed that lesson, then you'll resume the video where we can recap together, and I'll be going over what the key ideas from this lesson were and making sure that you saw all of those things that you did. So this process will look a little different than in class because you don't have that live support from your peers, but what you do have is an answer key printed along with this. It's actually attached to the assignment in Google Classroom. You also have my office hours from 9 to 11 where you can be asking questions during the lesson, and you can post those right to Google Classroom, and I'll get answers to you as quickly as I can. But the goal here is to make this as positive of a learning experience as possible and hit all of these key ideas for you. So to get that process started, let's talk about 9.1.2. This lesson titled, How Can I Measure It?, is all about volume and surface areas of prisms. So the good news here is that I think everyone in this class has been exposed to volume and surface area at some point. So that alone gives us a solid foundation here, but the goal in this lesson is to expand on our understanding and really get comfortable with different ways to visualize three-dimensional solids and also come up with a way to look at calculating the volume of many simple prisms and three-dimensional solids just by understanding what the volume of like a one-layered solid really looks like, and we'll get to that later in this lesson. Just to highlight a couple of things along the way, so during this lesson, please be sure to use all of the e-tools. I just clicked on one now. There are others throughout the lesson. Also, there's a resource page embedded that you can access. It's a net, which is intended to be printed out and cut out and folded. However, I know that some students in the past have been okay with not needing that net to actually visualize that. So I would encourage you to look at the net and try to visualize how it may fold before printing it. And then if you still need it, go back and print that resource out. So those are key things you'll need throughout the lesson. Notice at the end there is a learning log, which you should plan on adding to your typical learning log Google document, just like you would if we were in class. But other than that, let's talk key things along the way. So in this lesson, we're talking about surface area. We're looking at a net, which I mentioned earlier. We're working with prisms specifically, and we're going to dive into just a little bit and see, okay, what do we mean by bases of a prism or lateral faces? So those are all things you should feel comfortable with by the end of this lesson. You should also be getting pretty comfortable thinking about, okay, how do I come up with the volume of a prism if I can just find the volume of like one layer out of however many it has. And you'll understand that as you work through the lesson. So at this point, I'm going to set you guys free to pause this video and work the lesson at your own pace. But then when you return by hitting play, we'll be picking right up into the lesson recap. So make sure you've done the entire lesson first before returning here and hitting play. All right, guys, good luck with the lesson. And welcome back. Hopefully you're now at this point in the video because you've completed the entire lesson. And I think it's really important you guys work that lesson before just jumping to our recap, because although I'll be hitting the main ideas, the practice and some of the deeper meaning is still going to be embedded in the steps you're taking throughout this lesson. So make sure that you're being diligent in your process and working through this before you get started. So as you went through this lesson, they had some great ways to think about, okay, what does it mean if we see some different front, top, and right views of figures? Can we tell just by one view how many different cubes we'll have in that? And the answer should have been no, not from one. But if you had the front, top, and right like they provided, it seems like that should be enough to tell how many different cubes we have in each layer. So when we look at specific vocab embedded in that first problem, it's really important that you come away comfortable with our definition of surface area, which is the sum of all the areas of the surfaces of a three-dimensional solid. And that could be a cylinder. It could also be other figures like prisms. It could be a sphere. So right now, we're just specifically focused on things like prisms, but later we may expand that. When you worked with your net and thought about, okay, how could you fold that up to create three-dimensional solids, hopefully that gave you a little practice with a good spatial sense, so that you can get comfortable working with some of these figures, because nets can often be created to construct different prisms for us. And then really getting into 916 is where I thought the bulk of the important stuff in this lesson came in. And that's because they introduced this idea of looking at one layer, as you can see right where it says each layer of a figure, and I can clearly count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 cubes making that up, which lets me know that that layer itself has a volume of 7 cubic units. Now, if one layer has a volume of 7 cubic units, and I look at a tower that is constructed of 6 identical layers, well, it seems to make sense that I would take that 6 and multiply it by the 7 to get a total volume of 42 cubic units. And I think most of you will agree after doing this lesson that was the process that you chose. And the reason that can be helpful is, although we might not typically look at a figure and say, okay, what's one layer have? We may look at a figure and say, how can I find the area of a base? Which, by the way, they define here the base of a prism to be the two faces that are congruent and parallel. So if we look at a base and find just its area, well, that's kind of like finding the volume of one layer, just a really, really thin layer, like so thin it has no height. And that'll match, just like in our example here, where we had 7 cubic units for volume, coincidentally, just the area of one of its faces or bases was actually 7 square units. So using that idea to find the surface area, we can then multiply the surface area by the height and spread that area throughout this entire solid along all of its height. And that's a typical method we can use to calculate the volume of any prism. So we can take the area of one of its bases multiplied by the height, and that will give us the surface area, or excuse me, the volume, not the surface area. When we think about surface area, not only do we need to think about the area of the bases of a figure, but then we also need to think about the sides that connect the bases, which are the lateral faces, and we'll need to find those areas and add them all together, and then that sum will be our surface area. So those are the highlights from this lesson, and you had a chance to practice them throughout. I don't believe anything in here should have been brand new to you, but again, take time to let that sink in so that you really have a solid foundation for what we're doing going forward. Remember, part of your assignment here is to complete the review and preview, and then that's what you will take a picture of and turn in to this assignment on Google Classroom. If you have questions along the way, I have office hours on Google Classroom from 9 to 11, Monday through Friday. During that time, I'll be answering those questions on Google Classroom, so just put a comment on the homework assignment you're working on, and I'll comment back, and we'll get you all the answers that you need. All right, good luck, guys, and let me know if you have questions.